I'm Matt Booker.
And I'm Lauren Elkin, and this is The Concavity Show.
Oh. Thank you so much for being here today, Lauren. As you can hear, my guest today is Lauren Elkin. She is the author of a new book, came out in, I believe, September, called Scaffolding. And it's really her debut novel, although she's the author of plenty of other excellent writing, including the books Art, Monsters, and Flâneuse. Did I say that right? Flâneuse?
Yeah, it's good. That works.
Which was named, Flâneuse was a notable book of the year from the New York Times Book Review and was also a finalist for a Penn Diamonstein-Spielvogel Award. Did I say that right?
I think so.
Diamonstein?
Everyone has their own take.
It's like the Penn version of the book of essays, so it's a really
Yeah.
fantastic award. Her work has appeared in many places, including the New York Times, Granta, Le Monde, and Frieze, which is a great art magazine. She is a native New Yorker, but lived in Paris for 20 years, and we'll talk more about Paris today, and is now in London. So thanks for joining us from London.
Oh, thanks for having me.
And my co-host Dave sent his thanks. He could not be here today, but he also wanted me to express his admiration for your work. And I wanted to start out today by summarizing the book a bit, just very basically, that there's basically two stories of couples across about 40 years, I believe, in the same apartment in Paris, in Belleville, I think. And one of the things that connects these two stories over time is psychoanalysis. And in a way, this is a book, a novel of ideas, and that there's a lot of ideas in the air. There's a lot of ideas that the characters discuss. And so I wanted to ask if you could tell us a little bit more about your interest in psychoanalysis and Lacan in particular.
Mm. Yeah, sure. I first read Lacan when I was in a graduate seminar. I was doing my PhD in English, and we were assigned, I think it was the essay on the mirror stage. This would be around 2007, 2008. And I came to it with some trepidation. I didn't feel like, I was a great, authority on psychoanalysis. I'd read whatever Freud I had to in various classes and some Winnicott, a bit of Adam Phillips here and there. But I wasn't, coming to Lacan thinking like, great, this fits right in my wheelhouse. But I was really surprised to find in that essay that he offered a kind of theory of subjecthood, but more specifically of desire, that really resonated with me. This idea that we are formed as subjects at the moment when, as very, very little children, as early toddlers, we look in the mirror and realize that we are people who are separate unto ourselves. We're separate from our mother, separate from the parental units, and in that moment of kind of separation is this moment of kind of fundamental loss from whatever whoever our caregiver was, who made us feel kind of oceanic and infinite and never ending. um, and so there's that sense that as we become ourselves, we also are kind of indoctrinated into a kind of incompleteness or loss. And so we'll spend, the rest of our lives trying to cope with that lack, that feeling that we've lost something that we'll never get back. And so we channel that into like love affairs, cheating on various partners, also things as, seemingly minute as like shopping or like buying new things. There's that great like Virginia Woolf essay, Street Haunting. She has to just go buy a pencil. There's this idea that we've never got everything we need. We always need a pencil or a new lover or a new book or a new idea, that we're just these lacking bodies.
Yeah, I'm actually a big pencil collector, so that really taps into my desire for I
There
could
you
never
go, the
have enough
fetish.
pencils. I would probably buy more pencils today if it made me feel better, which it will. But that thing about desire, too, I think is really kind of core to the novel because, like you said, there is a lot of cheating, which I think of as like sort of French to begin with, anyways,
Mm,
or a less restrictive idea of marriage. And I wanted to ask you about that. This is a lot in the book also about sort of women specifically and oppression and their kind of stricture, stuck in traditional marriage
Mm.
roles, and maybe cheating as a way out of that, or cheating as a way, not necessarily cheating, but like you said, that present their selfhood. So,
Mm.
was there anything in particular? You're originally an American, but living in France.
Mhm.
Like, was there any sort of tension there between sort of traditional French roles versus, American housewife roles?
Yeah, definitely. I set the book in France knowing I wanted to write about desire and infidelity, specifically because, as Americans, we have this idea of, French marriages as being notoriously kind of open or flexible or, don't ask, don't tell kind of situations. And infidelity in an American context would have a much more um, kind of moralizing tone to it. And I wanted to get away from a moralizing idea about infidelity and really try to understand what it is we're looking for when we're unfaithful to our partners, when we look outside of our marriage. And so France, like PS, French people get just as pissed about infidelity as Americans do, but maybe because it's more, it happens much more often. It's sort of more. I don't know. It's also not a puritanical country the way America is. It's just a. It's not that it's not that everyone is welcome to do it. It's just that it doesn't have the same kind of, um, yeah, puritanical moralizing response when it does happen. So yeah, and then in terms of building the book around two different couples at a 40-year gap. So one couple is living in 1972 to 73. The other is 40 years later in the same apartment, though they don't know each other, in 2019, roughly. I also wanted to think about the ways in which the roles within a marital relationship have evolved. So someone cheating on someone else in 1972 is not the same thing as 2019. So it was a way of sort of looking at the way that our mores have evolved, the ways in which, as you said, gender roles have evolved. Florence, who is the woman in 1972, she's quite a, active feminist, and her husband really isn't. And she's saying to him, our mothers couldn't vote. Like, I only recently could have a bank account of my own. Like, it's very, very recent that women were even allowed to talk about, subjectivity and becoming your own person. It was very recent in France anyway that a woman could become her own person and practice her own desires and get a birth control pill and decide if she wants to have a baby or not. All of that is very, very new in the 1970s.
Yeah, and when you were speaking just then about especially the morality of the issue that is sort of self-enforced. There's a couple mentions in the book of Eric Romer, and I'm a big
Mm-hmm.
fan of his Six Moral Tales.
Mm-hmm.
And the premise of those movies is usually that there's a man who's tempted to cheat, but in the end he doesn't. And it's
Mm-hmm.
about that sort of temptation to do so, whether or not you actually execute on it. But in your book, it's like temptation and following through on it.
Uh-huh.
And I think, for me, there was, I want to talk about the signs that appear across Paris
Mm-hmm.
too. And in a way, I think there's some relation to this, and that the women have been sort of stuck in these roles where they were tempted but couldn't do it. And then
Mm-hmm.
tempted to do it without really any, not any moral consequences, but, the old, maybe Catholic consequences, or there's some freedom associated with that sort of self-agency. So that, can you explain also a little bit about just what those signs were that were slogans sort of appearing around town?
Yeah, so in 2019, in various parts of France, these feminist collectives started pasting up um, sort of feminist slogans or feminist phrases, or sometimes just a woman's name and a date of death, um, to sort of call attention to the fact that violence against women was higher, continues to be higher than ever before. And so that was very new then. It was like one letter per A4 sheet of paper, like a collage. Um, and they were really like so kind of graphically striking that you couldn't help noticing them. And I didn't intend to put them in the book. They kind of evolved out of this moment when Anna, the protagonist from the present day, is taking a really long walk through Paris towards the end. And as I was kind of conjuring up what she would see, I imagined one of these collages. And then as I was reviewing that section, I was like, oh, that's interesting that the colleuses have a little cameo. Is there maybe something else happening here? And so there was a kind of feminist thematic, but that moment, like my unconscious was clearly thinking like, no, we've got to double down. Like this has got to be a really important part of the book. And just the past few months, while this horrific rape trial has been happening in Avignon in the south of France, it's been really interesting to see the local colleuses, the local, feminist collectives, pasting up information about the trial. All of these men who are on trial for raping Gisèle Pelicot while her husband drugged her into sleeping. And so it's, there was just an article about it today in the Times, how striking it is that these feminists have decided to take to the streets and literally write on the walls things that people just weren't saying aloud or really acknowledging to themselves.
Yeah, that unfortunately is still an issue, still in the news, and probably will continue to be the rest of our lives. You mentioned Anna's walk through Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Even though this is a sort of domestic novel and about couples and married couples being inside, renovating a kitchen, there's scaffolding around the building, there's still a fair amount of walking around Paris, which is
Mm-hmm.
fantastically a literary experience in its own right. And I'm a big fan of your previous book, one of your previous books, Flâneuse, which is about walking around various cities and this sort of traditional male role of a flaneur, and what it might mean for a woman to have that job. And so I
Mm-hmm.
love that there's a big part of flaneusing in the book, and sort of integral to the setting of the story in both of the stories, really, in
Mm.
Scaffolding. And tell us a little bit about your interest in just why is Paris so literary? Why is it so
Hmm.
fun to just walk around and be a sort of roving eye, walking? Why is walking so key?
Um, I'm not sure what it is about Paris. I wonder this all the time. People ask me this all the time. And like, definitely, I learned to walk in cities when I was in New York as an undergraduate at Barnard on the Upper West Side. But I didn't really learn to love walking in cities until I moved to Paris to study abroad. So, not long after I first walked in a city in New York, I moved to Paris. And I think Paris is just so phenomenally beautiful. And it's arranged so that like it sort of highlights itself, shows itself off to its best angles. When Houseman was rejiggering the city streets, he was sort of thinking, okay, now if you look down this road, you're going to see like the Louvre and the mini Arc de Triomphe that's in front of the Louvre. If you look down this way, you're going to see the like Les Pyramides or Opera, something like that. So it's a city that is built to show itself off. And because it's such an old city and it has so many different like layers of history, and some are crumbling away so you can see what's underneath. I don't know. I think if you are a kind of romantically minded person, if you love cities, if you love history, Paris is just an amazing place to kind of walk around. It offers you a lot of like maybe foothold is an overdetermined word to choose, but like little footholds that you can sort of build on and I don't know, get it, understand yourself within the scope of history, or it's really hard to say. It feels like just a city that's full of ghosts and not eager to
Mm.
chase them from its streets, whereas other cities feel like they want to turn their back on the past.
No, that's a great point. And that idea of, layers of history is illustrated really well in Flâneuse, where you can see them digging up the city and you stop and
Mm,
watch them, literally dig down into the different layers of the streets, and the city. But this is, as I said, is really a book about being indoors in some way and what goes
mm-hmm.
on, in those buildings that you just walk past. And I want to ask you about the title. I think it's a great title. Scaffolding is a sort of temporary object, but it's also a sort of metaphor for, constructing the self. And so could you talk about, how that applies to the two different stories in the book?
Yeah, so the thing about scaffolding in Paris is that all the rule is that all buildings have to be refaced. I think it's every 10 years. So that's like pretty often in the life of a building. They clean them up, but it's a very, invasive kind of process. There's a lot of drilling and chipping and flinting to get that top layer of plaster off. And then they sort of, lay a new one, and then it's how the city has this like kind of very buttery, creamy facade that it shows to the world. That is obtained at the expense of the people,
Mm-hmm.
the mental health of the people who live in those buildings. So I was obviously living in a building that was refaced around the time that I was reading Lacan in 2007, and it was just a like very invasive and horrific experience. Sorry, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic. Like it wasn't that bad, but it felt like there was no peace for me in my home because the home was always under assault from these people who were remaking the facade. I had a little dog at the time, and he would just bark his head off at the workers. I was a graduate student. I was like, I can't get any work done. This is driving me crazy. It would start really early in the morning, sometimes go until quite late into the evening. Um, so it really was a kind of like existential crisis to be living through having the building refaced. And so I thought it would make a great subject for a novel, and specifically one about a woman who is, experiencing a moment of crisis, having just had a miscarriage, kind of a, late term miscarriage early in her second trimester. Her husband has taken a job in London. She's kind of on her own. She stopped working. She can't bring herself to go to work. As a psychoanalyst, she just can't listen to other people's problems. She can't cope with her own. She can't go outside. She's just kind of stuck inside. So that scaffolding, yeah, it's about, the kind of temporary structures that we erect to get ourselves through a tough spot. But it's almost because of the way that it functions in Paris. It's this idea that, a novel conventionally, it's this kind of arc, like for a character, they go through something and they come out different on the other end. We don't see them anymore, so we don't know what happens to them. But through the use of this kind of Parisian scaffolding, I was trying to think about the fact that, like, just because in a novel a character goes through something and then comes out the other end and is done, that doesn't mean that like that's it. Like we kind of, things are cyclical. You go through a crisis one moment, that doesn't mean you're done with crises. Like there's going to be another one. The scaffolding is going to go back up. You can think your marriage has survived one sort of attack on, the faithfulness of, and the what's the word, the kind of haven or shelter of your couple, but there's going to be another assault on it inevitably down the road. And how are you going to cope with it then? You can't just do it armed with morality. You have to do it armed with an understanding of desire and lack, and the fact that we're always missing something. We always need something else.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. And, when you were speaking, I think of, that sort of cities are always in flux. And that,
Mm.
I remember when I lived in New York, I used to work at Columbia on the Upper West Side. And they said, you're not a real New Yorker until you can walk past a building and say, this used to be that. Like
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's always changing. There's always scaffolding up, sometimes for no reason. It just seems like unexplainable. But my own story of like moving from the city to the suburbs, a lot of people escape the city to
Mm-hmm.
find some peace and quiet, and then find there's just as many leaf blowers and chainsaws and noise, and there's not really the idea of like escaping something. And there's back and
Mm-hmm.
forth between Paris and London, as you mentioned in this book a bit. The idea of like escaping the self, and there's some like subterfuge in the book as well as like trying to hide the affair, trying to escape, get out of this building,
Mm-hmm.
hide in a restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a really fascinating idea, but I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you about one thing I really loved about the novel is just sort of the style of it in terms of the shape of the pages and the writing on the page, and it's very fragmentary in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
and that um, it reminded me a bit of one of my favorite books, which is Mrs. Bridge, and that there's a lot of little scenes. It might just be a
Mm-hmm.
paragraph. It might just be, in sort of one, like I say, fragment of a story, and then it switches gears and goes back to another day, or it goes ahead. I want to ask you about, are you drawn to other books like this that have maybe, not necessarily a 50-page uninterrupted short story, but maybe
Mm-hmm.
a page, a paragraph, another paragraph. Like I find that kind of writing very approachable. Like
Mm-hmm.
it can make for a 400-page novel, but it doesn't feel like it because it's sort of easy to keep turning the pages. So I just wanted to ask you about
Mm-hmm.
that sort of look of the writing on the page.
Yeah, definitely. It's funny. I think that so I wrote this book over a period of 16 years. Like I went
Wow.
through a lot of
Wow.
changes in
Wow.
my own
Okay.
kind of writing life between 2007 and 2023 when I finally finished it. And I think when I started it, I was more of a conventional fiction writer. And so, some of the longer passages it's like looking down the layers of a city, like in the
Right.
layers of the book, you can tell those are the older ones. And there's even some imagery that I kind of cringe a little bit at now that I just left in because I don't know. I thought, why not have a cringeworthy moment in the book? But those are like older moments. And then as I wrote Flâneuse and whatever other stuff I've been writing in the interim, and then finally wrote that book that was on the bus, my bus book, number 91, number
I
91,
forgot to
92.
mention that in your bio, but that's a fantastic
Oh,
book
that's
as well.
okay. I'm very weirdly proud of that book. It's such a strange little book, but like because that book was a series of journal entries that I wrote on my phone, like some of them are very short, and I think I just got into the habit of like very quickly sketching something and then moving on through writing that book. And then I wrote Art Monsters after that, which is very fragmentary. And it's so funny. There's a great interview that Maggie Nelson gives somewhere about the Argonauts and the fragmentary nature of that book and the fact that she had been writing it soon after she had her child. And she said in the interview, I didn't go to the fragment because of nap time. And I didn't either. I was interested in the fragment before that, but Art Monsters is fragmentary because of nap time, because I was writing that book while I had a small child that I had to be looking after, and I often couldn't like explore a thought beyond, just a little like hit of it. And so by the time I was finally working on scaffolding properly, having amassed a lot of it, over the years, it was really after having finished Art Monsters. And so this idea of the fragment was kind of baked into my style by that point. And so I just realized I can get this novel done if I stop trying to force it to be a novel the way that I thought of it when I started it. If I just let it be whatever kind of writing it is, that might be somewhere between a novel and Flâneuse, or between a novel and the bus book, or even between a novel and Art Monsters, then it'll just be, and I'll just see what happens. And I liked what came out, and so decided to stick with it.
I absolutely love everything about what you just said because, I mean, I feel like that's our reality is fragmented in a way, and that's the way we experience life, and that it's rare that you have, an hour to sit down and focus on anything. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's much more, I don't know, realistic in a way for me to experience, a work of art that way as well. Maggie Nelson's a great example. Huge fan of Bluets, one of my all-time favorite
Mm-hmm.
books, and Argonauts as well. Like you said, super fragmentary, but the effect of adding up all of those fragments is just as complex and real to me in a way as if you had put in maybe more connective tissue. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that's an effect of just being more mature reader. As we age, we don't need as much of that sort of connective tissue. You can sort
Mm-hmm.
of let your mind build it in. But I really love the style of it. So I hope that you do more of those fragments, whether it's another book on the bus or whatever style you choose. I really love that format of
Yeah,
it.
I think I can't let it go.
Good.
The fiction project I've been working on continues in that vein, but the nonfiction project I've been working on works against it. I'm really trying to like develop my thoughts, and I'll just kind of give you a little bit and move on.
Yeah, you can have both. Maybe you can have both.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, all right, I have a really specific question for you now, and
Mm-hmm.
if I'm off base about this, we'll just cut it out of the episode.
Okay.
so, so the one of the stories in Anna's story, Anna, the beginning of the book, one of the sort of tropes is that she runs into this guy at the bakery every day,
Mm-hmm.
and if you live in the city, this kind of thing happens. You see the same people, same path that you're on they don't really talk very much. There's chit chat, but they sort of get used to seeing each other. Is that the guy from the 40 years before? Is that Henry? Is
Is that
that
the
the
kind of
bridge
thing that
across the stories?
you want me to give that away? I mean, obviously
It's
there's,
a spoiler alert.
yeah, it's a spoiler.
This
Okay, big old spoiler. And you can take from this whatever you will, but yes, that's Henry.
that's.
Um,
I just wanted to make sure that like I said, if you were like, no, you're totally off base, then we
yeah.
would just cut
No,
this.
that is
Okay.
him. For me, the real like, I don't know if I hinted at this enough. I think for me, there's a possibility that all of part two is in Anna's mind, that she's
Mm.
just imagined what might have been happening in her apartment, 40 years before she lived there, and imagined a story about this woman that she's so fascinated by in the opening. So that's one that's not a spoiler. That's just like a possible reading. But Henry, yeah, I'm okay with saying that that's him.
Okay. Well, I thought it was actually really subtle and well done. And like I said, this trope of sort of imagining the other inner lives of people that you don't really know, but you see regularly.
Hmm.
I think that does spark your imagination. And another sort of motif there is, I wanted to ask you about, that's a bridge across the stories, is the piano and Eric Satie.
Hmm.
And that's a sort of soundtrack to the book almost. And there's a mutual sort of interest in that, the piano, is it there in both apartments? Is there a piano?
They the In 1972, yeah, Florence has a really big piano that takes up the
Right.
whole living room. And in the present day, well, in 2019, Anna wants to get a piano, but she
Right.
doesn't have a piano.
So that's sort of like, I don't know if it's wish fulfillment, and this is getting back into psychoanalysis a bit of, um, imagining this desire that you mentioned of like filling some hole in yourself. But I wanted to ask you just a little bit about, like, did you have like a soundtrack in mind for the book? Like, there is a lot of other mentions of other artists and filmmakers and musicians, but Eric Satie is obviously a big
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. Yeah, I made it actually a soundtrack for it on Spotify.
Wow.
You can go look it up, Scaffolding soundtrack.
Send me the link and we'll put it in the show notes of this
I
episode. I would
will.
love to hear that.
Amazing.
I would love to hear that. Um, I wanted to ask you also, this is a little bit of changing gears, but because you brought up the Pellicot trial,
Hmm.
and we're recording this, we should say towards right at the very end of 2024.
Hmm.
And, here in the US, I'm sure you have lots of American friends and families, and like not a lot of hope right now in terms of what we are facing. And I just wondered if it's changed your perspective of sort of living outside of the United States, but obviously watching it closely.
Yeah, I mean, I I I moved out from America to France for good in 2004, shortly before the re-election of George W. Bush. But I remember feeling like, oh my God, that country re-elected this man. Like, make of what you would of 2000, when, there's like some people in Florida who didn't know how to punch a ballot slash the Supreme Court who,
No, I
who
have to
gave
say
us Bush.
2004 was
Yeah,
absolutely crushing. And I remember
yeah,
being so depressed, like unbelievably bewildered and depressed in
yeah,
2004.
exactly. And so in the intervening years, I've felt kind of up and down about America. I miss it, obviously. My parents are there, my friends are there, my sister, her family, her daughters. Like, I miss New York. But I just cannot bring myself to go back, even throughout the Obama era, even throughout, Biden's era, Biden's, presidency. The country, there's something like fundamentally wrong with a country that doesn't have gun laws, a country that repeals women's right to choose, like a country that keeps electing these like either, vapid men who are controlled by strong men, or these authoritarian fascists controlled by, crazy billionaires. Like, I just can't get my head around it. I think it's disgusting. As a neurodivergent person with a neurodivergent child, I am absolutely appalled that people I know, people I'm related to, people who my parents are friends with, would vote for this man who ridicules people with disabilities. Like, I'm just so sickened by it, and it's horrifying. And I know everyone is kind of regrouping and trying to, well, everyone on our side anyway, feeling like the resistance didn't work last time. We need to do something else this time, but we need to just take a rest and like not be engaging with the news right now and just kind of, I don't know if that is the right solution, but I feel like very guilty about having left America, and like I almost don't have a right to be like, no, don't regroup, keep paying attention. We have to keep paying attention. They're going to try recess appointments. They're going to try to, push through the debt ceiling. Like there's just all this horrific stuff that they're doing now while we're all feeling a little wounded and tired. So I don't know if it's this bad now. Imagine how much bad it's going to get when he's actually in.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll bring it back to the book a bit to say, this pushing on rolling back rights even further for, going back to 1972, 1973 is Roe v. Wade, and that rolling back, beyond that, one of the rumors, is that they're talking about rolling back, access to contraception. And,
Yeah.
that is a part in the book where, having birth control or not, and the right to communicate whether or not you are taking that on is, I don't know that men truly understand the centrality of this issue to women's lives and, what it has to do with being especially young, sexually active woman, and not having access to birth control is inconceivable, but there are women still alive today who can remember that and fought for that right and are now having to fight for it again.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about that because it does play a role in the book. I was looking at a part on page 161, 162, and this is Florence, and she's basically doesn't want to tell her husband whether or not she is on the pill. And I just wanted to maybe even speak to men a bit and understand a little bit about how, important of an issue this is.
Yeah, it's a really hard one because it seems so fundamental. It's like such a fundamental right. There's that old joke, like if men could get pregnant, like abortion would have been enshrined in the Constitution from the get-go.
It'd be at Starbucks, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's this idea that unfortunately feminism feels like, I think Judy Chicago says this somewhere, it's like you build a sandcastle on the beach and then the wave comes and washes it away, and then you build another one and then another wave comes, and after a while it's like maybe I should start building my castles further away from the water. But feminism is never, its aims are never like achieved once and for all. We cannot take it for granted when we have certain rights, which is why we cannot actually like let up and stop paying attention and let someone else take the wheel. We have to stay involved in, local government and grassroots organizing and making sure that at every level of, society and in the government, our rights and the rights of other marginal people are protected. That it's not just, billionaire white men making the rules according to their own whims and their own bottom line.
Yeah, no, I think that's, a critical part of why people should read this book is actually understanding, the centrality of that issue to women's lives. And rather than just speak about it, I was also going to ask if you would be willing to read a section of the book and just give people a taste of the prose that's in the book, if you wouldn't mind reading.
Yeah, gladly.
An excerpt.
I feel so like demoralized about how to speak to the people that like are the ones who voted for Trump. Like I know all of these white suburban women voted for Trump. Like I could send them all copies of my book, but I don't think that it would change anything, And there's this kind of mass like problem with expertise, with, people who have PhDs. Like there was a whole pile on Twitter the other day or last week because a girl got her PhD in like, sensory aspects of contemporary fiction or something, and people were like, what a bullshit
I
thing to
remember
get a
that.
degree in, and we have to pay, public money is supporting your PhD at Cambridge. And it was like such a stupid pile on, like, let the woman study smells in, whoever's work. Like why does that, how does that impinge on your liberties?
It's
Let the woman
ridiculous.
study. So it's this, I don't know, like I could send them all my book, but they'd be like, oh, it's France and she's got a PhD and Lacan and there's some stuff in French and it's not translated. Like, I don't know. I'm very grateful to the people who come to this book with an open mind. And I love this idea that we could send this book to people and they'd understand why birth control is important. But
Well, like you, I'm very easy to be negative and depressed and give up hope, and that's sort of like, I feel like you can't do that. That's what they want, is for you to just give up all hope and let them
yeah,
win. And I also read something recently which I really liked, which is like politics is the it's a process of addition. We need to add more people into our side rather
mm,
than excommunicate them and say, you're never welcome
yeah,
back over here. So
yeah,
I try
yeah,
to stay hopeful in the idea that there are some people whose minds could be effectively changed, whether they admit it or not. I try to stay hopeful in that. I know that's an important concept for raising
yeah,
children, is believing in sort of the plasticity of the
yeah.
mind, that people can change. I really have to
I
believe that.
know, I know. I
Um,
believe that too. I mean, that was the whole idea behind Kamala Harris's really big tent, right? You know, everybody from the progressives to Liz Cheney. And yet it didn't
Didn't
work.
work. Didn't work this
Didn't work.
time. For a lot of other reasons. It's a whole nother episode we could do just on
Yeah.
that. So, anyways, yeah, if you don't mind to just read a section of the book, it would be
Yeah,
really
gladly.
wonderful.
Okay, so this is from part one. It's the 2019 bit. It's pretty close to the beginning of the book. I think it kind of sets things up very nicely. In August, we were going to go on vacation to get away from what had happened, from the city, the heat, the tourist throngs, the shop fronts with their corrugated iron curtains down, congé d'été, réouverture fin août. Then David got the job in London and had to start immediately. They don't take the whole month of August off in London. And really, they don't here either. Belleville is bustling. The wealthy half of the city go on and on about their vacances to make the rest of us feel bad for not having the time or the money to go. To be fair, a lot of the people I know are indeed on vacation. My friends left for their country houses or their summer rentals one by one. My therapist went to the south, as she does every summer, available for emergency phone calls only. And then David went too. Right up until he left, the plan was for me to go with him. We were going to rent out our place. He found a flat in East London. It was all settled. New city, new life. I would see patients there. A real French psychoanalyst. They'll love it, he said. And you speak English. You'll be perfect. In the end, I couldn't bring myself to go. I don't want to leave you alone, he said. I said, I won't be alone. Look at all the other people out there. He said, that doesn't mean you won't be alone. The worst part about Paris in August is not the tourists, but the other Parisians who've stayed and think they have the city to themselves, so they have big parties at all hours. One night, the neighbors across the road partied till 5 in the morning. They kept me awake with their laughing and hooting, their yelling and singing, their Rihanna and their Madonna. Then, in a nice surprise, they played Céline Dion's On ne change pas, trop ringard, but that song was important to me a million years ago, when I'd first moved to Paris and knew basically no one. It was on the radio a lot then, and it had something to do with helping me decide the way I wanted to shape my life. Sometimes I wish I could reach out to the girl I used to be and tell her something, I have no idea what. And the song ends and some other crap begins, and I think about calling the neighborhood complaint line. Why am I not with my husband in London? I ask myself in those moments. What is wrong with me? The smells of Paris are more intense in August. Bodies and perfumes, warm rubber rising from the subway grates, the damp exhale of the buildings from their basement windows, synthetic smell of baking bread from second-rate boulangeries, hops and wood varnish from the Irish pubs, cigarettes, always, everywhere. It's going to be 34 today. The summer temperatures now reach numbers you never used to hear in my childhood: 34, 35, 36. At night, I sit alone in my office, looking out the window until late in the evening. Rimmed with the red sunset, the earth looks infected at the horizon line. Alone in the apartment is my preferred state. I can eat what I want when I want, watch what I want while I eat what I want, clean up the next day, no longer having to organize myself around other people, David, patients. And there's something more physical about the aloneness as well. I feel the space around me differently. It's not that it's quieter, it is a bodily experience of quiet. I am in the air differently. Looking out the kitchen window across the street, there is a light on in the chambre de bonne. As I stare at it, in the building dark but distinct against the sky, it seems to me that I am seeing the light on in that room as others have seen it for 100 years. The light itself no doubt changed from candlelight to gaslight to electricity. The change would have been subtle, the movement of the candlelit shadows giving way to the fixity of electric shadow. I feel unmoored from time. I mirror this feeling of drift in my habits. I avoid my phone. I watch television on the TV instead of my laptop. It's a real psychological shift to give myself over to the unpredictability of programming after the specificity of the series. It feels like wandering through a crowd or some kind of county fair, people getting up to things I didn't know they were doing. I click through people gardening, people making jazz music, experts in space travel speculating about what the Americans will do next, a documentary about the TGV, an old film about Vincent van Gogh that has a very young and very beautiful Elsa Zieberstein in it, as a prostitute in some kind of riverbank bordello. I land on a talk show in which women discuss the tribulations of new motherhood. They discuss the way our society has transformed it into a capitalist institution, how it is both competitive and possible to outsource. The guests talk about alienation from their labor and lament the loss of their jobs, their bodies, their identities. I change back to Elsa Zieberstein. Some days I lie on the bed immobilized for hours, as if a large sheet of cling film were pinning me in place. Or I stand at the window as the sky does its daily thing. In the shower, I turn down the hot and turn up the cold, and it feels good and alarming at the same time. One day on my way home from my run, I pass a sign which has been affixed to the wall of the building next door. Tu n'es pas seul. I don't have long to puzzle it over, because I run into Clémentine in the courtyard. She thanks me for the Janet Malcolm, says she's almost done and will bring it back soon. Says she wants to talk to me about transference, which she's never understood. Malcolm, she says something like transference is the explanation for why we can never really know the people we live with, because we invent them for ourselves instead of seeing them as they are. We cannot see each other plain, she says meaningfully. That's exactly what I've been trying to write about, Clémentine says. Can we discuss? Come whenever you like, I say. I'll stop there.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really glad you read that section because, I'm my favorite, probably some of my favorite parts of the book were this relationship between Anna and Clémentine.
Mm-hmm.
And, my last question for you is about a discussion those two characters have later on about Clémentine is not married, but she has a live-in boyfriend. They discuss, the two women discuss, maybe you should get married. And she says something like, I just don't think it's necessary to get married. It's a form of discipline developed to keep society moving along like a big normative machine. I don't think married people should have special privileges unmarried people don't have. And Anna says back, right, but that means you and Jonathan, if you spend your life together, won't have any of those privileges either. And she says, I don't want those benefits if everyone can have them. So my last question for you is really about the value of marriage. Like there's some debate about it in the book. What are your thoughts on that?
I have very conflicted thoughts. I was hoping writing this book would cure me of them, but they don't. I see both sides of it. I definitely side with Clémentine. I'm not currently married. I have a long-term partner who's the father of my child, but like we're not married. Maybe we'll get married. We don't have anything particularly against marriage, but we haven't had time to, and it's not like a big priority. But it's like, well, maybe, I don't know, surely there must be some advantage to it. That must be why everybody does it. And I don't actually know off the top of my head what the like legal, perks might be. But I agree with Clémentine. I think that, it's safer to get married. It's safer to hide from the world inside your little house with your partner and your children and not to breach that sort of the safety of that enclosure. But I think it's something that has to be undertaken like thoughtfully and with commitment, and not just a commitment you make once when you're at the altar, but something that you sort of live consciously and decide for yourself whether you're, married or single or, just in a partnership. And I think it is problematic that there are all kinds of benefits that heterosexual couples have historically, accrued that, now gay couples for like the last little while have been able to accrue as well, but it's not, not not a given in America now that Trump is getting back into the White House, and Clarence Thomas just can't wait to revisit Obergefell, is that the name of the case. And yeah, and in France, like gay couples are not allowed to do, they're not allowed, surrogacy is illegal. Female gay couples, I can't remember if they recently got this right or not. I'm really embarrassed to say I can't remember what the rule is in France, but for a long time they weren't allowed to do IVF. So there's just all sorts of like benefits and privileges that straight people take for granted when they get into a partnership and then march down the aisle, that people who are, not in that situation are not privy to. And so it just feels like, I don't know, marriage has got a long way to go before it feels like something that is generally available to everyone and something that everyone would benefit from. But Devorah Baum, who's a friend of mine and blurbed this book in the UK edition, I don't know if it's on the American edition, wrote a great book called On Marriage, where she takes all of these questions very seriously and addresses them with way more eloquence and thoughtfulness than I'm capable of. I'm just going to keep sort of muddling through it in fiction, but for like a really clear-eyed account from someone who's really articulate and lovely, like I recommend that book.
Oh, that's great. And I think, like you said, a lot of people sort of take these things for granted, and they're actually not. It's in a constant state of flux. And it's also something, now that my kids are getting older, I sort of think about it in terms of their relationships and what do I want for them in the future in their lives as well. And, where does that sort of discussion begin and end? But if it's okay with you, I think we're going to wrap it up there.
Yeah, great.
Lauren Elkin, thanks so much for being here today. Really appreciated this.
Thank you for having me.
And if people wanted to find more of your work, how can they find you? Do you have a website, social media?
I have a website. It's just laurenelkin.com, and I am on Instagram, very findable with a little blue tick. And I'm also on Blue Sky recently and sort of enjoying it.
Great. And we'll put links to all of that stuff in the show notes so people can just click on it on our website, concavityshow.com. That's it for this episode. As always, thanks for listening today. If you have enjoyed our episodes, please consider leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Special thanks to our Patreon supporters. If you're interested in becoming a sustaining member of this show, you can do that at patreon.com/concavityshow. That unlocks some bonus content. Plus, I can send you a sticker and a pencil. We'll be back with another episode soon. In the meantime, you can keep up with us on Instagram. Just search for Concavity Show, all one word. My personal Instagram is @MattBooker, all one word. You can always email us at concavityshow@gmail.com. Thanks.